This video took a long time to make, somewhere around 50 hours. I want to credit some others at the start here, as I did use some footage from some other creators on here. In some cases, it was out of necessity, as some of these MMOs no longer exist. In other cases, it saved me a lot of time from having to make the footage myself. As much as possible, I used my own footage, as I do in all my videos, but with this one, I did use a bit more outside footage than I normally do. So in the description, you will see a link to each video I used, and I asked for permission as well. If I forgot to ask anyone, or if there are any issues, please let me know. And I would appreciate if you guys went and took the time to go check the description and click on some of these videos and subscribe to some of these other creators. Thanks. The scope of this video changed dramatically from what I had originally planned. At first, I intended to just make a video explaining the Guild Wars 2 combo system and why I think more MMOs should use similar systems. Then I started thinking I could just integrate it into a video I had planned about what I want to see in the Ashes of Creation combat system, which we are likely going to see the new updates of soon. Then I thought, what if I just made a video describing what I would view as the perfect MMO combat system and use that as the first of a new series where I go through all the systems of an MMO and design my own perfect MMO systems and therefore my own perfect MMO. And when I say perfect, do know that I realize perfection is really not possible in an imperfect world, but I am going for as close to perfect as possible. And since things like combat tend to be somewhat subjective with everyone having slightly different tastes, this is more likely to be close to perfect for me personally, but not necessarily everyone else. But I do think having played MMOs for over 20 years helps to give me some insight into what truly is good and bad in terms of MMO combat. While my personal tastes in MMOs might not be mainstream, which I've covered in the past, my tastes in combat I do think are not that far away from the mainstream views of the average MMO player. But we will see on that, I guess. And I will say, there were a few things that inspired me to take on this task of building a perfect combat system. And ultimately, once the series is finished, the perfect MMO. 1. The Ashes of Creation Weather and Seasons livestream, which showcased a system that could easily be the best weather and seasons system in an MMO once finished. Now, of course, we have yet to see it in game and working with other systems, but if the concept comes to fruition, upon launch, it should be the best. The same with the character creator. Another source of inspiration was two of Never Knows Best videos, the history of MMOs and where it all went wrong, and how to save the MMO genre once and for all. They are very long videos, but I highly recommend watching them. Finishing up the idea of building a perfect MMO series a bit before we get into the combat, this is yet another way that I'm trying to do things a bit differently with this channel. It's not that I don't do some of the same things others do, because I definitely do. I'm not trying to virtue signal, but I do think a healthy percentage of my videos are fairly unique ideas. And as for making an MMO, many of us probably want to do that, but of course we can't. But we are gamers, we have great imaginations, right? We can dream big, that's what this will be. I have no idea how it will do with the algorithm, but I have stopped caring what the algorithm thinks. I'm just going to do what I want to do. To me, combat is by far the most important system in an MMO. The next most important system is not nearly as important. It is the system that the player interfaces with the most. A really great combat system can make up for other systems being lackluster to some extent. Of course, ideally, the best case scenario is all the systems of an MMO being good, but that is almost never the case. If you're going to go all out trying to build the best single system in any MMO ever, combat should really be the one you focused on the most. Now, I've played a ton of different MMOs. Like many of you, I have hopped around from MMO to MMO, especially in the last 15 years or so after getting burnt out on World of Warcraft. I have sunk a lot of time into the following MMOs, roughly in order of time played: WoW, Guild Wars 2, Rift, Wildstar, Black Desert Online, Arcade, New World, and Final Fantasy XIV. I am talking about getting the max level and engaging with the in-game content. WoW and Guild Wars 2 I have spent the most time in by far, but the others I have plenty of time in as well. And then there are countless MMOs I have at least installed, tried, and ultimately not decided to sink my soul into. Some of these had some interesting ideas as well in terms of combat. Just to mention a few, Darkfall, Terra, and yes, New World had some elements of combat I found good. I also want to mention a couple non-MMOs because these games were based on MMO Combat and they had incredible combat in my opinion. I am talking about Stunlock Studios and their games, Bloodline Champions, Battle Ride, and V-Rising. And also a little game few probably remember, Forge. I wasted a ton of time in that game in its short existence. These games are relevant because they are both based on WoW Arena, which is also why they failed. Instance 3v3 team deathmatch PvP does get old after a while. I enjoy it, but at the same time, it is nice to have other things to do in a game. So now you know what has influenced me in terms of MMO Combat. I also want to say that I am heavy into PvP in most MMOs I play, so I'm looking at it from that perspective as well. And no matter what, as humans, we have our biases. I have undoubtedly been influenced more by the games I have played the most. There's no way around that. Also, what each person views as good combat is probably different. It is a highly subjective subject. There are those that are very much on the action combat side, and there are those that are very much on the tab targeting side, and some like a mixture of both, which is where I fall in. Now, I personally believe we have not seen an MMO get close to the perfect combat system, at least based on what I want in a combat system. But I do think some MMOs got a few things very right. For fun, of the games I have listed above, I feel the following had the best combat. I am leaving out the non-MMOs to make it simpler, although Battle Right would probably make this list if it was an MMO. Forge was too buggy to make the cut. In order, here are what I personally view to be the top 5 MMOs in terms of combat systems. Number 1, Guild Wars 2. Number 2, Wildstar. Number 3, Black Desert Online. Number 4, Terra. And number 5, WoW and Final Fantasy XIV in a tie. Guild Wars 2, I think, had the best tab/action hybrid combat. Wildstar, I think, had the best overall action combat with Black Desert and Terra right behind. And I think WoW and Final Fantasy XIV do tab as well, if not better than anyone. I don't have a huge preference for either action or tab. I think both are fine. There are many people that are set on one or the other. I tend to prefer more action than tab, but I am not against having some hard lock abilities and a locked target. A blend of the two I think is probably fine. Now I want to break down each of these top 5 combat systems into what I think they did right and what I think they did wrong. Again, subjective, but this is an important step to ultimately make my final combat system. I'm going to take the good and eliminate the bad. First, Guild Wars 2. I do believe it has the best combat system of any MMO, but I also think it had many flaws. Again, I think MMOs can do so much better than we have seen to this point. Before I start though, I do want to mention that I played an absurd amount of structured PvP on Guild Wars 2, and in a few seasons I was able to move into the top 50 of the leaderboard. I know this combat system as well, if not better than the most played MMO on my list, World of Warcraft. Due to that, the complexity of Guild Wars 2's combat system, and the fact I felt it was the best, it will be the longest breakdown of all these combat systems. As I talk about some of these details, I will be trying to show relevant in-game footage, screenshots, wiki images, as much as possible to help explain these concepts in action or in deeper detail than words can convey, especially with Guild Wars 2. For pros, with Guild Wars 2 Combat, it was a hybrid combat system. I don't feel it is fair to call this combat action. If you have a target selected, your skill, if it is a skill shot, will aim towards your target. But what it does do is allow you to deselect your tab target and use your skill shot wherever you want to. You don't have to have a target to cast any ability, which is nice. So think of like the warrior charge in WoW, where you need to have a target and the target be in range. In Guild Wars 2, that is not the case. This adds a layer layer of dynamism to combat, which I find refreshing. I like that a lot of ranged abilities can be casted while moving. There are some bigger abilities that do root a player in place, but you can cancel the animation easily to get out of them. There's absolutely no animation locking in this game, which I personally love. I don't mind if big skills root a player, but I don't want to be stuck in an animation for a whole second without any way to escape that. That might work in Dark Souls. I don't think that works in an MMO. I like that all melee abilities cleave/can hit multiple enemies, and again, do not require a target to use. There is collision detection in this game, so unlike in tab target games where if you get a spell cast off and someone runs around the corner, the spell will go through the wall and hit the player. In Guild Wars 2, that is not the case. The spell will go in the direction it is cast. If a player moves out of the way, it will miss. There is more than one occasion where I've dodged a ranged skill while sitting on a capture point in PvP simply by moving side to side. I love this mechanic. While it is very small and not a well-known feature, projectiles actually did have a slight drop to them. It wasn't enough that it often affected gameplay, but it was a nice touch. The only times I ever saw it become much of a thing were when attacking a keep in World v World and attacking a defender that was above. Then you might notice the gravitational effect a bit. Another big thing that Guild Wars 2 did right was mounted combat. Mounts in general are incredibly well done in Guild Wars 2. The mounts having their own unique skills and their own health bar is pretty cool. While others had mounted combat, I think Guild Wars 2 did it the best. Prior to launch of Guild Wars 2, underwater combat was hyped as this big revolutionary thing they would have, and while I think they did a pretty good job, I would hardly call it revolutionary, but still, I put this in the pro category, and I think they did a lot of good things with it. Underwater combat in most MMOs is unbearable. It is at least tolerable in Guild Wars 2. There were specific weapons that could only be used underwater, and the skills had more of a thought to verticality than the ground-based weapons. Many of the utility skills did not work in water, so you automatically would swap to another set of underwater utilities that you could set up. It's a very low bar because all MMOs have pretty much sucked at this, but I think Guild Wars 2 did achieve the best underwater combat system as well. Another small thing, but nice to have for combat, is a very well thought out and organized buff and debuff system. I've always felt Guild Wars 2 had the best implementation of this with their boons and conditions. It was very clear what each did and how they worked together. Another very small thing related to this was the in-game tells that would show clearly what you were afflicted with. Other games do this too, but Guild Wars 2 I think did it slightly better than others. There were some added little touches that helped. For instance, even your character would sometimes actually say little phrases that would tell you what boon or condition they were just affected by. That combined with the visual effect on your character model meant you didn't always have to stare at your character bar to see what you were afflicted with. One of the more underrated features of Guild Wars 2 combat was the combo system. Some skills could lay down a combo field, and other skills were combo finishers. Now, the combo itself often did not have a dramatic effect on the skill. It wouldn't drastically increase your DPS, but some of the boons and conditions one could get from those combos absolutely could swing encounters in your favor. The extra little bit of healing or condition removal could separate a good group from a great group. Things like AoE stealth for your whole team before an engagement starts absolutely can be beneficial, or AoE swiftness before the match starts to get to the capture points faster. In the early days of World v World before mounts, this was a very important feature to make use of. That is all the things I feel Guild Wars 2 did right for combat, but the list of cons might be surprisingly long for someone that felt this combat was the best we have seen in the genre. The first con is the lack of a holy trinity. How does that relate to the combat? Well, what it did is mean every class had to have its own heal skill, and oftentimes there was quite a few other sources of healing. And on top of self-healing, there was a ton of evasion / iframes. For those that don't know, an iframe is an invincibility frame. Is a period of time that a player cannot take damage, and some classes have a lot of access to this. Most notably, the dodge skill is an iframe, which the way the dodge was implemented in this game I feel was a bit of a disappointment, because remember that I said that there is projectile collision in this game? They could have made the dodge just a quick movement to avoid damage from big attacks, which would actually make it action oriented instead of just an iframe with movement. They probably would have had to reduce the cooldown of it to make it actually be useful in that case. The current implementation of it is crazy useful, it's just not that dynamic. The lack of a holy trinity meant all classes played like a ret paladin from old school World of Warcraft, good damage and self-sustain. At least that is how it felt to me, and range classes all felt like a boomkin. Again, good damage and self-sustain. This led to too much homogeneity between classes and devalues the impact of combat in my eyes. Next up, the downstate. For those unaware of what that is, players would not die when their health bar hit 0. Instead, they went to a downstate with a new health bar that would slowly drop down and would drop more quickly if the player took damage. For someone to die, that health bar would have to hit 0, or there was a stomp mechanic that mobs and enemy players could use. This was a fairly long animation, and it was possible to use CC to interrupt this animation. Now, this was yet another mechanic that was likely implemented because of the lack of a trinity, and it came with issues. There were some very cool plays that could be made with the downstate in PvP, some long cooldown abilities that could instant revive someone from the downstate, making proper use of boons like stability, which provided a brief CC immunity window that could give you enough time to get a res off on a down player. But at the same time, because of the self-healing, because of the access to iframes, and some classes even having stealth access, the time to kill in most metas was often very short. By time to kill in this instance, I am talking about the time it took for a player to put another player into the downstate. And in higher end PvE encounters, it was also similar. Make just one mistake in a boss fight and you could be in the downstate pretty quickly. I think they had to do this to make PvE more challenging and to make PvP not become a stalemate. But the negative of it is, I hate very short time to kill in MMOs. This is not a feature I like for MMO Combat at all. The reason for this is, MMOs are not first person shooters. You have a lot of depth in terms of rotations, cooldowns, and tons of opportunity for counterplay. Now, I am not against the threat of big spike damage being present and giving players something to think about at all times in that regard, but one-shots or globals or whatever you want to call them, I find those to be a bad design choice. Give players a chance to respawn. Now, much of what I just said is in regards to PvP combat. In terms of PvE, I am not necessarily against having boss one-shot mechanics be a thing, as long as there is a way the player, through good play of himself and his group, can avoid it. Or even if it can't be avoided, if the group has access to things like battle reses with very long cooldowns, that is enough to offset it. But in general, in both PvE and PvP, getting 100 to 0'd on your health bar without a chance to respawn is not good combat. There might be some rare exceptions in PvE that it is acceptable in order to increase the difficulty of raid encounters, but in PvP definitely not. Part of what I always felt compelling about MMO Combat, especially in PvP situations, is the opportunities for counterplay. Proper timing of big cooldowns, either defensively or offensively, can completely shift a fight. So the time to kill in Guild Wars 2 is firmly in the con category for me, which concludes the pros and cons of Guild Wars 2 combat. The crazy thing is, despite all of these issues, I still find Guild Wars 2 to have the best combat, and despite many issues I have with the game as a whole, such as being way too casual focused, the lack of a trinity, and the lack of vertical progression, I still play Guild Wars 2 off and on. I get bored with it after a month or so and quit for several months, but I still come back, I think mostly because of the combat, which is why I think combat is so important. If you can make great combat, it can make up for some of the other systems being lackluster. Next, I want to talk about an MMO that I think had the best overall action combat, Wildstar. This might be a surprise choice for many, and it is certainly close between Wildstar, Black Desert, and Terra in terms of action combat, and a lot of it comes down to personal preference yet again. It's been a long time since I've played it, so my memory might not be perfect, but I'm going to run down the pros and cons like I did for Guild Wars 2. For pros, Wildstar had a lot of movement while casting abilities. There wasn't much rooting in place while casting. I love this, and this is what puts Wildstar above Terra, which had way too much rooting in place and animation locking. If Terra did not have that, it would move much higher on my list. Another pro, and this is very much personal preference, but I actually preferred the telegraph system that made spell aiming a skill shot similar to what you might see in an isometric MOBA or ARPG. On top of that, most casted abilities had a decent amount of width to them so that landing your skill shot was not nearly as hard as say with a reticle system. I really prefer this over a reticle aim. I don't think an MMORPG should just go heavily into becoming an FPS, but some action and aiming is perfectly fine. Just make it so you don't have to be a Counter-Strike pro to actually hit things. Wildstar did that very well. Another pro, and this is a pro for all the rest of the games in my top 5, it had the Trinity. I won't be mentioning it as a pro for the rest of the MMOs for brevity's sake, but it certainly is my view. Now on to the bad. Wildstar only allowed 8 abilities on your hotbar. I will never understand why action MMOs think they need to have so few abilities. For me, this just makes combat become stale as you tend to spam your first few low cooldown abilities non-stop. It makes for less variety. One of the things I love about MMO Combat is having a lot of abilities to manage. Managing rotations and defensive and offensive cooldowns, and the immense counterplay it provides I really like. Another negative for me was that at times the telegraph system could get a little messy in group PvE and PvP. Overlapping telegraphs would make a mess of the screen. But overall, Wildstar I think did a very good job with combat. Yeah, the game as a whole had some issues, but in my opinion, combat was not one of them. Next, I want to talk about an MMO that I think had very good action combat, Black Desert. Now, I didn't play Black Desert nearly as much as Guild Wars 2, and I haven't played it much recently at all. So I may be out of touch on what combat is currently like, and my memory might not serve me 100% on what I did experience, but as a result, this will be much faster than the Guild Wars 2 combat rundown. For pros, I think the combat just felt very good. It was very fluid. They had their own combo system, but the difference between this and Guild Wars 2 is that was only for your skills. So you could combo one skill into another. It took some getting used to, but I really liked it. There was some animation locking, but nothing like Terra, and in a lot of cases you could get out of the animation lock by comboing, or you could just wait as the animations for skills were very quick to finish. So I will not put the animation locking into the cons category, more neutral here. I don't like animation locking, but it worked fine with BDO. For cons, basically the combat was built for the solo AoE grindfest that was in-game in this MMO. A lot of skills had AoE components, and AoEing down huge packs of enemies similar to an ARPG was how the game was designed. For me, this isn't something I find enjoyable after a while, and while this is not directly related to combat, there was a very short time to kill in PvP if someone outgeared you, and there were huge disparities in power. Again, not entirely the combat system's fault, but I don't like insta-kills in MMOs. For equally geared players in PvP, it often came down to who landed the first CC. There were not as many opportunities for counterplay if someone gets the jump on you. And then there was also the issue of FPS and ping having a much bigger effect on your combat effectiveness than in other MMOs. If you had a very high frame rate and low ping, your animations would actually finish faster, giving you a huge advantage. Again, I'm not sure if this was ever fixed, but I do know it was an issue at one time. Overall, BDO Combat felt much better than Wildstar, but it had these mini issues that keeps it behind Wildstar on my list. Next on the list, Terra. Terra had really good action combat overall. Many view it as the best action combat in any MMO, but I had two major issues with it. I don't actually like full reticle aiming in an MMO, and having every single skill require precision aim. That is more personal preference than anything. The other issue is one more people tend to have with Terra, and that was the extreme animation locking and slow animations in general. I do not like completely losing control of my character just from casting an ability, and if I do have that, I would like a way to cancel out of that. While there was some animation canceling on some classes in Terra, it was pretty limited. Without the animation locking, Terra would easily move above Wildstar. Next, rounding out the top 5, WoW and Final Fantasy. Both tab targeting. I feel these two probably did it the best of anybody, but most other tab MMOs I think did a very similar job with this. For pros, I find having access to a lot of abilities, which most tab targeting MMOs have, is nice. I've already talked about this, but the rotation management, etc. was fun for me. Another nice thing is the even playing field. Lower FPS and ping players were not at a huge disadvantage. Another pro is the responsiveness and polish are often very good with these combat systems. This is a tried and true system that has been perfected to some degree. The main negative is tab targeting does feel a bit dated. It often does not feel as fun or as engaging as systems that incorporate at least some action elements. Tab was originally a design choice used because of the limitations of the internet at the time. In the early days of MMOs, dial-up internet was still pervasive, and tab targeting with the global cooldown made combat possible back then. So that finishes the pros and cons for my top 5 MMO combat systems. Now, using this information, I'm going to construct my perfect combat system. I say perfect in air quotes here again, as true perfection is nearly impossible to achieve, and the only way to achieve anything close to perfection would require playtesting. So for me, I am going with a hybrid system. The exact percentage might be shifted based on player feedback over time, but I'm going with 60% of skills being tab target casted abilities. But I still will have projectile collision. Spells will not lock on and go through walls, so using terrain to line of sight after a spell cast will be a thing, similar to Guild Wars 2. Also, really dynamic things like another player literally stepping in front of a projectile to save a low HP group member are a thing in this system. And the projectile gravity physics, yes, I'll have that as well. Like in Guild Wars 2, all abilities will be able to be cast without a target, so abilities that have a movement component can be used outside of combat. Like in Guild Wars 2 and Wildstar, most abilities will be castable while moving. I will have some abilities that root the player, but the rooting will come with a trade-off. The skill will be a strong skill. A great example is actually the prismatic beam for mages in Ashes of Creation. It does root in place, but if you hit it, it hits very hard, in Alpha 1 at least. And no matter what, all abilities can be cancelled. There is not any animation locking at all. Of course, the trade-off is the spell still goes into a cooldown. Maybe not a full cooldown if it never actually casts. So it still has consequence, but the added dynamic element is nice. I'm going to have very little iframes or full immunity in this game. There may be some of that, but I want avoiding damage to be more active and not just hitting your 8 different abilities that have iframes. I will also have some abilities on a global cooldown, but I think the GCD will be very short instead of a full second. Maybe 0.25 or 0.5 second global cooldown. This will still even the playing field in terms of ping somewhat, but will be less restricting and more interesting for players as a whole. I don't necessarily want to speed up the pace of play per se, but I don't want combat to feel like a fighting game or an FPS, with Twitch being the most important factor. But I do want it to feel a little faster than the old school tab targeting games. I haven't covered it yet, but some MMOs have a strange mechanic that feels like a bug the devs were too lazy to fix: animation canceling. This is where you cancel an ability right before the animation ends, but the cast still finishes and the damage still registers. But what this does is allow you to then cast another ability faster, thereby increasing your DPS, HPS, etc. Not going to be a thing in my combat system. Also, I want to have fake casting be a thing. This is something that you see in high-level WoW Arena. People will cast a spell but cancel it before it finishes. This is a way to bait silence abilities in CC. This adds to dynamism, and I want it to be a thing. For action spells, I am using a combination of Wildstar and Terra. Most action skill shots will use the Wildstar telegraph system. Many skills will not be incredibly hard to land, maybe harder in PvP of course, but the telegraph will be wide enough for a lot of abilities to be somewhat easy to hit. And then a small percentage of abilities might switch to a crosshair reticle similar to Terra. This might be activated on the first button press of the skill, and the skill is actually fired on the second press. And I'll have full customization available in the UI to turn the telegraph and reticle to always on or off with hotkeys, or only on with skill pressed down but not released. You get the idea, and you've probably seen these features in really good UI systems before. For number of skills, I think most classes I want to have a pretty decent number of skills. Let's say 8 to 10 core rotation skills, then 3 to 5 defensive skills, 3 to 5 offensive skills, and 5 utilities situational skills, and some non-combat skills and pre-fight buff skills on top of that as well. So a really decent amount of skills and cooldowns to manage. Similar to some versions of WoW, but not every version though, as they have pruned a lot of skills over the years. That combined with the action system for some skills means the depth of the combat in this system would be very high. At the end I will talk more about why, because of the depth, an expansive tutorial and leveling curve that eases the player in are critical. Another element of the combat system I want to discuss is RNG. Now, RNG is something that is kind of a staple in MMOs, and I want RNG in my MMO, but I want the effect of RNG to be somewhat small, smaller than a lot of MMOs. I don't want critical strikes to be massive spikes in damage. A 5 to 10% boost is all, and I don't want talents and gearing that greatly increases crit chances. Crit chances moving all the way to 50% or more is too high, in my opinion. Maybe the max crit chance that one can get through talents and gear is 30%. In my combat system, and the trade-off for going all in on crit chance will be a loss of survivability, which we have often seen in MMOs, glass cannons so to speak. As for RNG in terms of procs, that can vary and be a bit higher than 30%, as long as the time to kill is reasonably long, such that in a PvP encounter there is a decent chance that the luck ends up evening out. As for the actual time to kill, I want to keep it around 1 minute for a 1v1 PvP fight, all things being equal. For larger scale fights, it could naturally be shorter, but say an even 3v3 encounter happens. Let's say over a large sample size of 3v3 fights, the average first death is 45 seconds to 1 minute. I think that is fine. 5v5, let's say the average death is 30 seconds to 45 seconds. And in large scale, 10v10 plus, very fast kills are probably a thing. In PvE, the hardest encounters could have one-shot mechanics and one mistake causing a death, but more often than not, in normal play, I want players to have a chance to respond to a threat and not get one shot. And yes, in case you haven't realized it yet, I am having a holy trinity in this game. Now, as for healing in action, I want to have the hybrid system also apply to healers, meaning some heals will use the action aiming system and some will use the tab system. And overall, I want to make healing more fun than it often is. Oftentimes, healing becomes a healer just clicking on a raid frame over and over again. It is a bit of a whack-a-mole experience for the player. Some of that comes down to add-ons being installed that change the way the healing works. I'm likely not allowing add-ons in my MMO. Instead, I will have a great and highly customizable UI. That is, of course, another video idea, but with that, I, as the dev, can control the healing experience for the player and not turn it into a clickfest. For tanks, I want there to be more action than normal with them. Some actual active blocking and dodging with a stamina system. Not just spamming taunts and doing a simple DPS rotation, but some management of your own active blocks and use of dodges to quickly evade big attacks. Similar in some respects to how New World did tanking, except without the animation locking and with a lot more skills, and of course not full action either. Some of the tanking will still resemble the tanking in World of Warcraft. I don't want players to only sit there and actively block, they can also use tab abilities to taunt and reduce damage taken, but the active part will make it feel better, I think. Speaking of dodging, I do want every class to have a dodge similar to Guild Wars 2, and a stamina meter as well. And also like Guild Wars 2, I want the dodge to work slightly different for each class. A different animation, and maybe like New World, a different length of dodge. And I want the dodge to be active, not an iframe like Guild Wars 2, because we will have projectile collision, players can just move out of projectile paths to avoid it. The dodge is there for the times normal run speed cannot achieve that, and you really need to avoid a big damage ability. And related to the Trinity, while I very much want to have a Trinity, and I want tanks and healers to be different and more active and therefore more difficult playstyle than in past MMOs, I also want DPS to have more responsibilities in raids than just mindlessly spamming their DPS rotation and avoiding the red spots on the ground. I want DPS to have some role in keeping teammates alive as well. Now, we have seen this before to some extent. Warlocks in World of Warcraft had Hellstones and Soulstones, for instance, but that is a more passive playstyle, and I want more active skill-based play. So instead of the majority of the big oh shit cooldowns like lay on hands from the Holy Paladin and World of Warcraft being on the healer and or tanks, I want the majority of these cooldowns to be managed by the DPS. If the healer and tank role is going to be even harder than normal with the more active playstyle, then I want to shift some of that responsibility to the DPS. Now we have seen some of that in MMOs before, but in general most of the big instant full heals and huge bubbles were from the healers and some from the tanks. A few big defensive cooldowns on DPS have been a thing, but most of the time they were only for the individual character, and not as often could they be used on group members. I want to have more of these abilities be usable on group members, and in fact I want a decent amount of the high cooldown oh shit buttons not to be able to be casted on yourself. They can only be used on group members. This adds to the dynamic feel, in my opinion. I do of course want to almost directly copy the Guild Wars 2 boons and condition systems, but I will obviously make some changes to the naming to fit my lore and world. And I think I will make it bigger, with even more buffs and debuffs than they had. And I also want to expand upon the idea of making the debuffs and buffs highly visual on the player model, and make the sound options of the player character able to be tuned to whatever the player wants. For instance, in Guild Wars 2, your character would only occasionally announce new afflictions. I want the user to be able to turn that on to announce every new affliction if they want. This might sound spammy if turned on, but since add-ons are not a thing, I like having that as an option. This will reduce the reliance on the player needing to stare at his or her buff and debuff bar, and instead allow the player to look at the game world and the encounter more. It's a small touch, but I think a very good one. Next, I am stealing the Guild Wars 2 combo fields and combo finishers, but I am buffing them a bit, making them a bit stronger to encourage players to use them more often to maximize dynamic team-based combat. On top of that, I want to include some player-only combos similar to what Black Desert did, so a certain sequence of abilities could give some boost to damage and or other buffs. I also want to have some very high cooldown but very impactful elite skills similar to what Guild Wars 2 did, but more of them. And as for combat resources, this might be fairly standard: health, stamina, rage, energy, mana, all the standard things for the most part. But I also want some ultimate abilities in this game that can only be activated when an ultimate resource is fully charged. This resource name will probably be different for each class, and the ways it is generated might be different for each class. This is something we see in games like Overwatch, for instance. Some MMOs do this well. Guild Wars 2 had some specializations that had this mechanic. The druid building up astral force to become a celestial avatar, which gave it access to new powerful skills, is a good example. Which is also something this combat system will have: changing forms, which changes your active skills. Not a new or unique thing, but a dynamic gameplay element. Next, I want there to be some verticality and parkour elements to combat. Wildstar had a double jump system, which was kind of interesting, but what I want is some skills. Not a lot, but I do want some skills that send a character very briefly, very high up in the air, very quickly. And then the character could send down some damage from way above, or it could just be used for scouting, or just getting to a different area more quickly. But the cooldown would naturally have to be very high on these skills. A great example is from my favorite MOBA of all time, Smite. The god Rama had an ultimate that sent it very high up, and it could cast 3 large AoE circles, a decent range. For my MMO, one class will have this as an ultimate, but the distance in the air will be higher and the range of the AoEs will be bigger. But I also want counters to a lot of these things. There will also be an ultimate that has a very long range that can pull people out of the sky or from very far away on the ground. I want some very high cooldown abilities that have crazy range, not this boring max range of 40 meters stuff. Most skills probably have the standard max range, but some abilities that are on very high cooldown, such as ultimates, will have really incredible effects in terms of range and or magnitude. A single sniper shot with big damage and massive range. You can't spam it, and the cooldown is perhaps even hours or even a full day, but something that could really add to the threat level in PvP situations. A grappling hook ability that can be used on the environment or on players. That could allow someone to quickly climb a wall or some terrain would be a lot of fun. Ways to infiltrate keeps that do not require breaking down the walls. Keeps would eventually be able to be upgraded to have a roof to eliminate this as an issue, but this threat would be cool to have in the game. Again, I don't want these skills to be spammable. Since we are on the topic of counters, there are two mechanics from Stunlock Studios games such as Bloodline Champions and Battle Right that I will have in this game. One is simply called a counter, a spell you would channel, and if an enemy hit you while the spell is channeled, something good would happen to you. It could be a teleport to and quick attack on your target. It could mean your target is pulled towards you. It could give you a shield or a heal. And since we have an ultimate system with energy like Battle Right, we are going to have EX abilities. This was where you could use some of your ultimate energy to boost some of your skills. The trade-off is, of course, it will now take longer to charge your ultimate, but it gives more complexity, and again, the word I use all the time in this video, dynamic gameplay. Also, I want some parkour in combat. Parkour movement is going to be a thing in my MMO. Climbing is a thing, but I also want some skills to play off this system. So for instance, imagining a rogue that could send himself bouncing off a wall to land behind an enemy player or mob, or a skill that allows the rogue to quickly climb a wall or cling to the ceiling. Maybe even attacking briefly from the ceiling or rappelling down and doing a quick attack. Now I will have time limits on how long someone can be on the ceiling, but the idea is I want more of the three-dimensional world to be utilized by players for combat. I want some action abilities to be able to be bounced off walls, which is another thing that was done in Smite. The telegraph system would be useful here. And there will be terrain and environmental destruction with skills. Think of V-Rising, for instance, skills impacting the trees and gatherables in the world. And to some extent, this MMO will have terraforming as well. There will be limitations on it, and it will only be available in certain regions, but in those regions, some of your skills will be strong enough to actually terraform a bit, and some skills will be able to make use of the environment both offensively or defensively in these areas. So think of Dota 2 and Nature's Prophet turning trees into minions that fight for him. A tank class could have the ability to form a dirt or rock wall that is fully terraformed, removing terrain from a nearby area to quickly form a wall that can block projectiles. Enemies will have to destroy the wall using their own spells to get through. Because of the impact of some of the ultimate skills, there will absolutely be separate PvE and PvP balance. This is something I think all MMOs should do, but I do realize for smaller dev teams this is a huge challenge to pull off. In some cases, skills will work very differently in PvP and PvE, and others just the range or damage modifiers will change. Before I move on to underwater combat, take a moment to look at what we have so far for our combat system. Now, as for underwater combat, what I want to do is take the Guild Wars 2 system and greatly expand upon it. Guild Wars 2 had a water breather for everyone, so you could never run out of breath. I like that, and we will have that. Also, you moved much faster underwater than most MMOs. I also want that, but I will be increasing the speed even more. And I want to increase the range of a lot of skills by a decent amount. And I want a few very long cooldown, very long range skills that can pull enemies to a player, or pull your character to your target, whether that be an enemy player or an object, such as a ship or a mount. And for mounted combat, again, I'm using a very similar system to Guild Wars 2. Very unique mounts, and each with very unique abilities that can be unlocked via a similar type of mastery system. Certain mounts might be better for certain situations. Of course, there will be limitations on where they can be used, but for raids, for instance, I want players to be allowed to use them when out of combat, even in an instance, and I want there to be reasons to use them, say at the start of a fight to maybe stack a certain buff, or maybe to avoid a big spike of damage that might occur if you're not at the right spot at the start of an engagement. Maybe at the start of some raid bosses, the boss is triggered as soon as the first member is within 150 meters, and then if you do not get within 100 meters of the boss within 5 seconds of this, you take some big early spike damage. Thus the mount would be the only way to avoid the damage, and maybe even the mount could be used during the fight if the player is not currently taking damage. But overall, I do want the player to be more strong in combat when not mounted, but for there to be certain situations where mounting and perhaps even using certain skills during an engagement might be more optimal. And I want to expand this mounted combat into the air, sea, on top of the water, and below the water. I will expand upon this further as we talk about naval, air, and underwater combat. I do want to mention one MMO that did not make the top 5, but has a system I want to adopt and modify. That is ArcAge and its naval combat. Spoiler alert, but I also want trade and caravans and resource scarcity in certain areas, making players moving materials via ships a necessity, which can and does lead to some great open world PvP encounters. But I want to greatly expand upon what ArcAge did well with their naval combat in my system. To me, ArcAge had the best naval combat of any MMO, and Ashes of Creation is using a very similar system, but I think my additions will take it to the next level. As for ships, what I want is for there to be a huge cargo ship that can handle massive payloads. They might be a bit weak to attacks, so escort ships will be required. I want to have all different types of ships, fast attack ships, big but slower battleships with huge cannons that can do big damage, and even carrier ships for launching and landing both airships and flying mounts, if the zone allows flying mounts. Not every zone will have flying as an option, but I think in the seas I will often have it as an option to make the PvP much more dynamic. But transporting goods and materials in the air will be limited to force the transport to happen on land and sea. And the airships will not be the most powerful thing ever in most cases. Maybe there are some extremely high level air mounts and ships that are more powerful, but those would take a lot of time and effort for the players to unlock. And the amount of them in the world will be limited in some way so they don't completely imbalance combat. I definitely want some mechanics in place to make sure one guild, faction, or alliance does not have all the powerful air mounts on the server. The most powerful vessels will be the big, slower battleships, but their weakness is speed. Enough quick harassment from smaller underwater mounts and crafts, and on the surface and in the air, and you could take them down over time with quick in and out strikes. Even kamikaze attacks will be an option. If an airship runs out of ammo and is low on health, it might choose to crash into a battleship and do some damage to it. So there will be ship collision in the game as well. The trade-off of a kamikaze attack will be large enough though, as the player will be forced to respawn very far from the fight and not likely to participate in the rest of the fight, so it is something that players would have to weigh carefully before doing. There will even be ships that are specifically designed for kamikaze rounds with large explosives on board, and there will be bombers, both mounted bombers and airship bombers, but again, I don't want the air combat to dominate. I want the land and the sea combat to be more powerful, but with air as more of a support system. Think of how air worked in World War I, where it was still early days for air combat and fairly primitive. A bit like that, but maybe slightly stronger and more useful, but not dominant like air warfare is in modern times. As for airships and air mounts and who would have access to them, I want them to be more accessible than what Ashes of Creation is going for, but maybe a bit less accessible than what World of Warcraft has. And again, not every zone will have flying, but flying will add a very interesting dynamic to PvP combat in this game, so I want it to be available in a fair amount of areas. Let's say 60% of areas for now. I think in most water zones it will be accessible to get that land, sea, and air combat experience, but in a fantasy MMORPG setting. As for water-based mounts, they will not be as powerful as the ships, of course, but some of them might be fast enough for quick hit-and-run attack. The same with the submergible mounts. I also want submergible player-run ships, but I don't want them to be a dominant force either, just a support force, some quick strike, hit and run damage, some scatting capabilities, etc. Smaller, quicker, submergible, and on-surface ships will be able to send boarding parties for players to try to take over an enemy ship. But the key here is risk-reward again. If spotted by the enemy ship, especially the very powerful battleships, then the powerful guns will quickly overwhelm these small craft. But an infiltration, if successful, and if the players that board are well-geared and skilled PvPers, could completely change a battle. The battleships will be able to unlock some ability to track enemy movement, even underwater, but these will be late stage unlocks and take a lot of time to get unlocked, but very useful once unlocked. I really think that this land, air, and sea system will be incredible, but I don't want it to be a thing that is available everywhere. I do want some land-only combat with traditional siege weapons and land-mounted vehicles, and mounts being the only options, to give some variety, and to not overshadow what I think is already a very deep and engaging combat system without the naval and air combat components. And that concludes the air and sea combat systems. The challenge of this incredibly deep combat system is to make the combat not completely intimidating for new players. I think that might be solved by the leveling system and new player experience, which is outside the scope of this video, but long story short, I would not want to throw the full complexity at the player at the beginning, which most MMOs do fairly well. But also the early game should not be boring and should be fun and a great learning experience, which a lot of MMOs fail at. But again, I am diverging a bit from the combat system. And with that, I do think I have covered everything in terms of combat in this fictional MMO. This would be my ideal combat system. It would only get to a near perfect state through actual playtesting, of course, but I do think the concept of this combat system would be near the best ever seen, and certainly the best for my taste. But because this is a fictional MMO, and because I won't actually be playtesting it, give me some feedback in the comments and let me know what features you think should be scrapped or added. Maybe there's some other cool concepts that I didn't think about. And you know what? We'll do a little scope creep in a future video and maybe add some of those things if I like them. And I know what I described is probably something that would take an insane budget to produce. This MMO as a whole is being designed as a concept that basically assumes an unlimited budget. I do want to say that I am straight up stealing the character creator and weather and seasonal systems from Ashes of Creation. So far we have the character creator, weather and seasons, and combat, and I've leaked a few other elements throughout this video. I haven't decided yet what other features I will steal from other MMOs, but rest assured I will be doing some of that. If it isn't broke, don't fix it is a mantra of mine, but in many cases I'm going to be doing just like I did with combat, taking the good and removing the bad to make a more perfect system. As I said, the scope of this video became more and more massive each time I sat down to brainstorm and write the script. It is probably my longest scripted video by far once I finish editing it, and maybe my longest video of all, but we will see. I hope you enjoyed it, but I have no idea what the algorithm is going to think of it. I certainly enjoyed making it, and I really think that matters more than what the soulless algorithm thinks anyway. With that, I'll see you in the next video.